Chapter 4.4, Art and Science, Part 1. So, in this part of Part 4 of the book, and the themes, we're going to look at how art and science come together in a couple different ways, some ancient and some modern uh, ideas about art and science. So, the way that art and science is usually seen, I would say, really with the 20th century, things got really sort of specialized, is the best way I can explain it, that everybody had so much information to work with that even different types of scientists don't really interact. It's very specific to whatever they're studying, and artists even that way are that way a bit too. Sculptors are, sort of discussing things with other sculptors, painters are with painters, and that kind of thing. So because things got so specialized, art and science became very separate, if that makes sense. Wasn't always the case. But one of the things that is true of both, if you look down here, is this exploratory nature that involves intensive trial and error. What I just went to a conference in 2017. It was really amazing about art and science, and one of the things that was mentioned is that both the artist and the scientist is on the verge of creating something new or discovering something new. So that part of the brain or that way of thinking is unique to both. So it's not just that the artist is creating a new work of art that no one's ever seen. A scientist oftentimes is discovering something, an experiment in the lab perhaps, or an archaeologist you can even think of as a soft science, out discovering a ruin or something like that. They're finding things that no one's ever seen before. So in that way, that part of the brain is being stimulated. But generally, we think of art as being intuitive and emotional, and science being rational and objective. So that's the way we're breaking that up. But we do have some interactions, and partly too because of the way our world has become more technical and mechanical and robotic, and using our internet skills. There's a lot of ways to use the internet to make art now, and Photoshop and so on, and different ways to set up artworks. And we're going to look at some of those that react to an environment, like bio art. So there's a lot of ways to sort of cross pollinate these two concepts or these two ways of thinking in the work. So we're kind of opening that back up to sort of a more connected way of thinking about these two things. Okay, so our art celebrating science is going to be our first category. Our artists have observed and recorded scientific advancements and studied operations and dissections to understand human anatomy. So in our first example, we're going to look at good old Leonardo da Vinci. I'm sure that's an artist you've already known about, very familiar with. You've probably even seen this image, but a little more explanation here. One beautiful thing here is we have this square and circle, which are very elemental forms, are geometric forms. The circle is both organic and geometric, by the way. But this is Vitruvian Man, Study of the Human Body. Vitruvius was one of the few existing thinkers that his work survived from. He was a Roman architect, and it survived from the 1st century BC. Now remember, Leonardo is synonymous with the Renaissance. The Renaissance comes to mean to us one thing, which is a Renaissance man. In particular, we think of Leonardo and Michelangelo and some of the others, but that they are able to do many different sorts of things. So that's one thing we think about when we think about Leonardo. He designed weaponry. He did this mirror writing up here. This is all backward and can't be read with the naked eye. Well, at least not to some of us. Has to be shown in a mirror. And he's dealing with scale and proportion here, and relative to architecture as well. And I'll explain that in a moment. But also Renaissance, the literal meaning is rebirth. Naissance is like, if you think of neonatal, it's similar to that word when a baby's born. So Renaissance is a rebirth of classical Greek and Roman ideas. So with Leonardo sort of reanimating Vitruvius, and this says Vitruvian man, so that's basically an extension of the ideas that he's reading about in the architect Vitruvius's notes. He's sort of reestablishing the sensibilities of classical Greek and Roman thinking. So that's partly what the Renaissance is about. It's about it's remaining within the Catholic structure. They are Leonardo and Michelangelo both work for the Pope at times or other religious figures, and they are Catholic, but they're bringing in some of these ideas from the early Roman world, what we call the ancient world. When we say ancient world, we really mean Greek, Roman, and Egyptian, a little bit of Mesopotamia or Persia, but basically the default would be Greek and Roman. Okay, so some of the measurements here that we're looking at is that this wingspan, that's the way I've always thought of it, I guess, your wingspan, meaning your fingers tip to tip this way, equal the height of the body head to toe. So that's one way that we're thinking about measurements here. Another one is the size of the foot. And we don't exactly see this here, but it is supposedly noted in this writing. The foot, 7 feet, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 would be the height of the person. We talk about it as heads now. Like if you take an illustration class and you're going to illustrate a model, like an idea for a fashion, you're going to do 8 heads to elongate the body, but the norm is 7 heads. And the head and the foot are similar heights as well. So that's something that relates to one another. And what's the other one? Oh, the distance from the elbow. I was kind of forget about this. Elbow to tip of finger. See this marcation here. To tip of finger is 1/4 of the height. So that would be 4 of those. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can kind of see those markings in this drawing, but it's a little bit difficult to see. But that's what he's getting at. That there's these proportional elements to the figure to draw it and to paint it correctly or sculpt it correctly, if that makes sense. And that's going back to the Greek and Roman concepts because they had that not only with figures, but they also had that with architecture. So there were 10 books on architecture. It's the only surviving architectural treatise from the ancient world. And treatise outlined the ideal proportions of man, argued that architecture could imitate these proportions. And that's partly why we talk about classical proportions. We also talk about the golden mean or the rule of thirds, but we're going to get into section 1 and part 1 of our book, not through part 4. So his text is based on the ancient Roman architect. That's all that writing that we see there. And he also studied corpses to verify what he was looking at. So Joseph Wright of Derby, this is kind of a disturbing image, and it's really not one I want to spend a lot of time on personally, but of course it's important. I feel a lot like this little girl right here. Just want to turn away. In this time period, 1768, we're in the Age of Enlightenment, and we are experimenting and exploring things, and unfortunately, a lot of times experiments were done on animals. So in this case, a vacuum is being created through this device by, this fellow here. So he's sort of pulling the air out of the this bowl that it's in. The air is trapped off, and the bird is down to its last few breaths. So they're kind of observing the idea of the vacuum. He is part of the Lunar Society, Joseph Wright was, and you kind of see that symbol of the moon coming through the window. We know that through this. And also that the Lunar Society was a combination of manufacturers, experimenters, and developments of science and technology. That's on page 604. So a lot of things are happening starting in the Age of Enlightenment, where science is emerging as we know it now, as trying to figure out how does the body work, how does breathing work in this case. So it's a little bit disturbing, but that is what they're doing. The last thing I want to mention here is tenebrism, this extreme bright bright light here, and then all the darkness here. So enlightenment, the idea that the light is symbolizing enlightenment, and tenebrism is this high contrast. Okay. Symbol of knowledge, right? Another image that's also a bit disturbing if we look closely, but nowadays we see surgeries on television all the time. It's not too horrifying to us, and it's a very small area of the painting. But Thomas Eakins, about 100 years later, we're starting to get into anesthesia. So this gentleman here is an anesthesiologist, and he's keeping the patient under. That wasn't available that previous 100 years. So surgery of any kind done prior to this time, the late 19th century, was done basically with strong liquor or somebody biting onto something and just dealing with the pain. It's kind of amazing to think about that. But an anesthetologist, anesthesia, the idea of putting someone under, relatively new in science, and it's increasing the ability to do more complex surgeries. Of course, these guys probably did not all wash their hands, unfortunately. Germs were not in full discovery mode at that point yet, and a lot of people died from the infection from the surgery. The surgeries might be successful, but there was a lot of infections at this time, and you can see they're just kind of wearing their street clothes. They're not in scrubs or anything like that. This is a real surgery, or meant to be, and there are students in the gallery observing. This still happens today in medical schools, where you can observe, but the conditions are far more sterile. This is the mother of this person here with this infected leg, which she wouldn't normally be there. And that's the thing, when doctors sort of make you wait off to the side, it's really hard to see your loved one cut open. So we really don't make people go through that kind of thing. You're off in another room, or you stayed at home or something like that. But anyway, it's just to show the horror, to kind of exemplify that. But Thomas Eakins was a really interesting painter, beautiful painting. He does a lot of things with the body, but this particular one is more to do with anatomy. But this is a famous surgeon, Dr. Samuel Gross in Philadelphia. And on page 604, we're still there. He's removing dead tissue. And anything else I want to say about this detailed, realistic depiction? And this is kind of contemporaneous with Impressionism, but we have more of realism here. This is more of a realistic look. All right. So it's a useful historical document, and it's a heightened emotional impact with the theatrical lighting, not unlike the other painting we looked at with our bird. Okay?